The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. That's Alan Watts.
A very fitting quote for today, I think.
Definitely. Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We're here, as always, to unpack the source material you've shared with us and pull out the key takeaways.
And today we're plunging into a topic that's certainly changing and moving, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Yeah, it's been such a massive force globally for, over a decade now? But the sources you've provided, primarily from the Indian Express for this discussion, suggest it's hitting some, significant shifts.
That's right. So our mission today is really to explore these recent changes, look at the problems cropping up in different countries, see how China's actually adapting its strategy, and sort of figure out what this might mean for the BRI going forward.
Okay. And the source material does seem to lay it out pretty clearly. The evolution, country-specific challenges, China's reactions both internally and externally, and the potential fallout. It feels like a really critical perspective, especially useful, say, if you're keeping up with current affairs for exams like the UPSC or just for general understanding.
Absolutely.
Right, let's unpack this one.
So maybe the best place to start is that foundational vision. President Xi Jinping, back in October 2023, marking the 10-year point, said something like, viewing others' development as a threat will not make one's own life better.
Yeah, I remember that. It sounded very much like a pitch for, win-win cooperation, mutual benefit.
That was the rhetoric, yes.
Yeah.
But the source we're looking at immediately puts that next to the reality on the ground.
Which is?
Well, the argument presented is that despite that talk, the practical result for a lot of partners, maybe 140 countries, has been what the source calls asymmetric dependence.
Meaning they rely much more on China than China relies on them.
Exactly. Tied, of course, to the sheer scale of the BRI investment. The source mentions figures over $1.175 trillion in contracts and investments.
Wow. $1.175 trillion. That's just immense. And there's a financial crunch looming too, right? The source flagged that.
It did. Analysts estimate something like $35 billion in BRI loans could be due for repayment just in 2025.
Oof.
And the real worry highlighted is that many of the countries facing these repayments are, already financially quite fragile, developing economies mainly.
So, okay, that's the tension right there. You've got this stated vision of shared growth and then this reality of potential debt burdens and this heavy reliance. What does that mismatch really tell us about how the BRI has played out so far, according to the source?
It strongly suggests the original model ran into some serious problems. It forced Beijing to kind of rethink things. The source is quite direct. The BRI is shifting gears.
Not just tweaking, but a fundamental shift into this new era the source talks about.
Yeah. It seems to be moving away from just being a money-pumping endeavor.
Yeah.
Focused purely on big numbers and massive projects.
And instead, moving towards, what was the phrase? Small but smart and beautiful projects.
That's the one. It really captures a change in scale and maybe focus.
Why the change, though? What reasons does the source give?
Several key things. Growing pushback and suspicion internationally about the BRI's motives and impact.
Okay.
Also, frankly, some big projects just didn't get finished or haven't performed well.
Right.
And crucially, the increasing difficulty partner countries are facing in actually paying back the loans, that debt stress we mentioned.
So President Xi's comments in 2023, framing it as a new stage, the source sees that as basically an admission that the old way wasn't quite sustainable.
Sort of an implicit acknowledgement, yes. A course correction was needed, and the source uses some really potent examples to show what these challenges look like on the ground.
Let's get into those. Pakistan seems like a major one, with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC.
Yeah, Pakistan is a critical case. It really highlights the debt aspect. The source points out that something like 22% of Pakistan's total external debt is owed to China. That's almost $29 billion.
$29 billion, and a lot of that tied to CPEC.
Largely, yes. And remember, CPEC was initially promoted as this crown jewel of the BRI in Asia. Huge promises.
The initial pledge was massive, wasn't it? $62 billion.
That was the figure, yeah. And the source says about $26.6 billion has actually been invested so far.
Okay, so still a huge amount. What did that fund?
Major stuff. Plans for special economic zones in places like Karachi, Sialkot, Rusalpur. Big developments at Gwadar Port.
That strategic port, right?
Exactly. Plus, much-needed energy power plants and even things like a Pak-China Technical and Vocational Institute.
So the investment was real. But the source seems pretty clear that CPEC hasn't really delivered the economic boom Pakistan hoped for. Why not?
According to the source, it points heavily towards internal factors within Pakistan. Ongoing security problems, for one. Insurgency, like the Balochistan Liberation Army, impacting projects, militancy in Karachi. Even with security, these create major disruptions.
And basic infrastructure issues, too.
Yes, things like frequent power outages, supply chain problems.
Uh-huh.
They make it hard to build things and then operate them efficiently. And maybe most interestingly, the source actually cites a Chinese government article from way back in 2018.
Oh, what did it say?
It apparently highlighted Pakistan's own challenges with corruption and dwindling foreign exchange reserves.
Yeah.
Even Beijing seemed aware of these underlying issues quite early on.
Which connects directly to Pakistan constantly needing IMF bailouts, right?
Exactly. It really shows, as the source suggests, how powerful these domestic factors are. Stability, security, governance, corruption. They can really water down the impact of huge external investments, no matter how much money comes in.
That's a crucial point. It's not just about the money. Okay, let's pivot to another neighbor the source focuses on, Sri Lanka. They also had a massive economic crisis.
Right. Sri Lanka offers a slightly different perspective on the challenges. The Hambantota port is central here.
Ah, yes, the port deal. That was controversial.
Very. A Chinese state-owned company, Siam Port, ended up with a majority stake and long lease after Sri Lanka struggled with repayments. It's often cited as giving Beijing a strategic position in the Indian Ocean.
And the source highlights a specific stalled project there.
Yeah, an oil refinery planned for the port complex. It kicked off in 2019, but then basically ground to a halt between 2020 and 2024.
Right during Sri Lanka's big economic meltdown.
Precisely. That crisis was driven by huge sovereign debt issues. Though, it's worth noting, the source does mention that officially, only about 10% of Sri Lanka's total debt was owed directly to China.
Still, that refinery, for an island nation importing most of its fuel, that would seem pretty vital, wouldn't it? For energy security, maybe growth?
You'd think so. Huge potential benefits. However, the source introduces another layer of claim, it notes, if true, that the whole Hambantota development has been tangled up in corruption.
Corruption involving...
The suggestion mentioned in the source is potential collusion between China and local elites in Sri Lanka. And the implication is, if that's the case, it could seriously undermine the project's viability and whether Sri Lanka ever sees the benefits.
Okay, this is where comparing them gets really interesting, based on the source material. Pakistan seems like instability, security, maybe systemic governance issues were key hurdles. Sri Lanka, more of a national economic collapse, maybe mixed with specific project-level corruption.
Exactly. Different paths, different specific problems, but both involved in BRI, both facing debt issues, both seeing major projects struggle. It really shows that BRI isn't monolithic. Its impact varies hugely depending on the local context.
So faced with all this debt stress, project delays, corruption concerns, security issues, how is China actually changing its approach? The source says they're changing gears and tactics.
Right. This brings us to what President Xi called that new stage of high-quality development. The source interprets this as a move towards being more results-oriented.
Focusing on whether things actually get done and work.
Seems like it. Less emphasis on just the scale. And the source lists some revamped goals that sound, well, quite different.
Like what?
More focus on green and sustainable infrastructure, promoting scientific innovation, people-to-people exchanges, and significantly, a new stress on high-level principles of integrity.
Integrity. That definitely sounds like a response to the corruption issues we just talked about.
It certainly seems timed that way. And to back this up, there's new money, too. The source mentions a new financing window announced in 2023, about 350 billion yuan, roughly $48 billion, from the China Development Bank and the Exim Bank.
Okay, so new goals, new money. But the source also points to something happening inside China, a crackdown.
A major one, yeah. This is quite dramatic. The source details a big 2024 anti-corruption campaign by China's watchdog, the CCDI.
Targeting.
Specifically targeting embezzlement and bribery within the whole BRI financing system.
And we're not talking small fish here, are we? The source gave examples.
Not at all. High-level figures. Wang Yongxing, former deputy president of the China Development Bank, expelled from the party.
Okay.
And then Liu Liange. He was president of the Exim Bank, a key BRI lender from 2015 to 2018. He received a death sentence in November 2024 for corruption and illegal loans.
A death sentence? Wow. The source does clarify, though, that the official announcements didn't directly link these guys to specific BRI projects by name.
Correct. But the crucial point the source makes is these were top people. They were right at the heart of the state banks making massive decisions about BRI funding during its biggest growth spurt.
So what does this internal crackdown signal then? Is it a genuine attempt to clean up the system? How might it affect future BRI deals? It raises some big questions.
It definitely raises questions. It signals, at the very least, a new seriousness about tackling corruption, which, as the source implies through the Sri Lanka example and that 2018 Chinese article on Pakistan, was a known vulnerability. Will it lead to cleaner, better projects everywhere? That remains to be seen. But it's a significant internal move described in the source.
And they're adjusting externally, too, adapting how they work with partners. The source mentioned changes in Pakistan and Sri Lanka again.
That's right. For Pakistan, there was that announcement of CPEC 2.0 back in May 2025.
The upgraded version. And it sounds different.
Yeah, the focus described in the source is more on cooperation in industry, agriculture, energy, minerals, security, even human resource development. The key thing noted is it's not necessarily centered around those huge, mighty infrastructure projects of Phase 1.
Interesting. A shift towards potentially less capital-intensive stuff, maybe less prone to those big debt problems.
Possibly. Seems like a strategic pivot. And in Sri Lanka, there's a similar effort to get things moving again.
The oil refinery.
Exactly. The source mentions a deal in January 2025 between Sinopec, the Chinese energy giant, and Sri Lanka to specifically fast-track that stalled refinery project, trying to break the deadlock.
So they're not walking away from these key relationships, definitely changing the terms of engagement, it seems.
Adjusting tactics based on the hard lessons learned, perhaps.
Okay, so taking all this into account, the internal cleanup, the external shifts, the new goals, the new funding, what does the source suggest the road ahead looks like for the BRI?
The general take seems to be that Chinese investment through the BRI probably won't just stop.
But it's likely to slow down compared to that initial massive expansion phase.
Although, interestingly, the source does cite some pretty recent numbers, late April 2025, from China's Ministry of Commerce.
Oh, yeah. What did they show?
Non-financial direct investment in BRI countries was actually up 16.8% year-on-year in the first quarter, hitting about $8 billion. And new construction contracts signed were worth around $47 billion.
Huh. So money is still flowing. Maybe it's just becoming more targeted, more selective about where it goes and what kind of projects.
That seems plausible. The source contrasts the potential outcomes. In stronger economies, maybe like Singapore, BRI investments might offer genuine growth benefits with less risk.
But there's
Yeah.
a but, isn't there?
A big one. The source warns quite strongly that smaller, more vulnerable economies, it specifically mentions parts of the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, Africa, could end up being the biggest victims of a BRI-induced debt trap.
Okay. Why them specifically?
The source lays out a few reasons. They often already owe a large proportion of their debt to China. Their own domestic institutions might be weaker for managing big projects and the resulting debt. And crucially, they often lack other global options for getting that kind of large-scale funding.
And this is all happening, as the source notes, while global debt is at a record high overall, $324 trillion in Q1 2025.
Exactly. So vulnerable countries are needing funds in a world already awash in debt, making initiatives like BRI, even with the highlighted risks, still very attractive, or perhaps necessary.
The source kind of ends on a note of hope, though, that future BRI funding might focus more on actual sustainability and deliverability.
Yes, learning from the past decade's experiences.
Which really brings it back to you, our listener. What stands out to you in these stories from Pakistan or Sri Lanka? How do you see these shifts in China's strategy playing out?
Especially if you're following these things closely, maybe for UPSC prep, where understanding these global dynamics is vital, or just to make sense of the news. How might these changes impact economies or politics in your region?
Why should you care about how the Belt and Road Initiative evolves? Well, because it's undeniably a huge factor shaping global development, trade patterns, debt levels, and geopolitics. Understanding its transformation is, I think, pretty key to understanding the world right now.
So, just to quickly recap what the source material suggests. The BRI is clearly past its initial phase, grappling with major challenges like debt and project execution. This has triggered a strategic shift towards potentially smaller, smarter projects with a new emphasis on quality and integrity.
We're seeing China react with internal anti-corruption drives targeting key financial players and external adjustments like CPEC 2.0, moving beyond just mega infrastructure.
The future likely holds continued, but perhaps slower and more selective, Chinese investment. But the risks, particularly the debt risks, remain very real for vulnerable economies.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over, drawing from our discussion today. Considering these shifts, the small but smart focus, the internal crackdowns, the external adaptations, does this represent a truly fundamental change in the BRI's core purpose? genuinely prioritizing sustainable development for its partners now?
Or is it more of a strategic adaptation, a necessary adjustment to make the initiative more durable, less prone to criticism, but ultimately still serving China's long-term economic and geopolitical aims in a tougher global landscape? Something to think about.
Indeed. This has been our deep dive, guided by the insights and the source material you provided, which today was primarily from the Indian Express.
We really hope this discussion has given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced view of the BRI's current state and future direction.
Thanks for joining us. If you found this useful, especially for staying on top of current affairs for exams or just general knowledge, please do give us a like and subscribe. It really helps other people find the discussion. And definitely leave a comment if you have questions or other topics you'd like us to tackle.
Until next time.